Days away from President Obama addressing the nation, a joint Chamber of Commerce address to try to right this rickety ship. David Stockman, you were telling me during the break, we're kind of each in our respective positions here and hard to move the ball from here, right?
Yeah, and I think what's going to be proposed, because it's all leaked already Thursday night, is exactly the wrong thing. It's more of the same old Keynesian medicine that
more
has
spending.
Completely failed, which is pump priming, deficit spending. And we are now at the point where we've run out of balance sheet as a nation. We're at the end of the line. Our credit card is no longer good.
Well, Republicans counter, he's got to propose some big tax cuts. David Stockman says that won't work either.
No, because the tax cuts at this stage of the game with a $1.3 trillion built-in deficit will, on the margin, just lead to more borrowing. And if we have more borrowing, the debt's going to go from 16 to 17 to 18 to 20
But if it gets
trillion.
Companies growing and hiring again and booming again, then the growth will offset all of that. You don't buy it?
I don't buy that because, they've tried that all around the world, and it's okay when you don't have a huge balance sheet problem. But when you've reached the limits of your balance sheet, which clearly we have, our debt is at 100% of GDP. It is dangerous to have that much debt.
So you're not at all surprised that our debt was downgraded?
No, and it should be, because we're proving almost by the day that we have no ability to govern ourselves fiscally. We have both parties dug in, one party refusing to yield an inch on taxes, even though taxes at 15% of GDP are at their lowest point since 1940.
In the aggregate. Right.
In the aggregate. We have the other party saying Social Security isn't part of the problem.
So what would David Stockman do?
I think we have to do what I call RED, revenue, entitlements, and defense. All three have to go through major changes because we need to raise 6, 7, 800 billion of improvement in the
How would you break it down? How much in revenue?
I would do half in revenue. I would do half in spending.
In this economy, you would do that much in revenue?
You're not going to do it overnight, but on a 2, 3, or 4 year basis, you have to begin to enact it and build it in with a target that by 2013 or 2014, we should be moving to close this $1.3 trillion deficit. We can't add $1 trillion or $1.5 trillion.
But throughout that process, whether you get it down to $0.5 trillion or whatever, you're still adding to the debt.
You are.
So the debt, even under this latest debt deal, still increases by $7 trillion over 10 years rather than $9.1 trillion, I guess.
Yeah, and that's
so. Then what?
Well, but the problem, and that's why I think it is really as dire as it is that all of these projections you see and the $1.5 trillion that's supposed to be saved by this super committee is over 10 years in an economy that over that period of time will generate $200 trillion of GDP. So they're talking about,
Yeah, oh no, you're right. It's stupid.
They're talking about a rounding error, but here's what I think is important to recognize. The real built-in deficit is much bigger than the numbers Washington is using. And the reason for it is that the built-in deficit is on a baseline that assumes 12 years without a recession. We've had a recession every 4 years since 1948.
And minimal growth, by the way, that's double what we're already experiencing.
It's assuming 3% real growth when in the last 10 years we've barely had 1%. It's assuming 20 million new jobs in the next 10 years when in the last 10 years we've gained none. In other words, the employment report last Friday showed 130.7 million jobs in the American economy, the same number as January 2000. So therefore, if you adjust the outlook for a realistic assessment of the difficulties and the headwinds that this economy may face, especially if Europe collapses and the euro collapses, which I think it will, especially if one of these days China has a big slowdown, because it is a house of cards, and they will. If you put all of those realistic factors in, we're facing 10 to 15 trillion of new debt over the next 10 years on top of that amount that we have today. And I don't believe we can survive it. And the only way that we're surviving it right now is the Fed has been printing money like there's no tomorrow.
And you said that's unrealistic.
And I don't think it's sustainable, and we've already seen that the Fed has stopped its QE2. There is all this chatter about QE3. That would be a big mistake.
More easing, more buying
And what we're doing is basically the Fed has destroyed the government bond market. The Fed has destroyed the capital markets. And so therefore, all of it is manipulated. All of it is artificial as a result of this huge intervention by the Federal Reserve and the other central banks.
So things are much worse than even they appear now.
Yes, it is.
Okay. We're going to take a quick break. As I was hearing David speak, I was thinking he might be dealing with our obesity epidemic, because if you're in the middle of eating your dinner as you're hearing this, you've probably stopped.